So hello, I'm here with Dr. Michelle Albert, and she was one of our opening plenary speakers at our Vascular Discovery meeting in Seattle. And Michelle's work has been absolutely so critical in understanding some of the ways that racial disparities contribute to poor cardiovascular outcomes, and just the various ways where that stress and resilience really directly impact health, particularly in communities of color and other disadvantaged groups. So, Dr. Albert, I was so intrigued by not only the data showing how this stress directly impacts cardiovascular outcomes, but then of course now we have this pandemic that is adding on to all of these extra stressors. So both from an actual mechanistic cardiovascular way and from the way that it is disproportionately affecting communities of color and others. So how have you sort of seen the pandemic add to so much of the work that you've already done?
So thank you so much for that question. And it was indeed an honor to be able to be part of the opening session yesterday, focused on disparities for atherosclerosis vascular biology discovery 2022. The first thing I would say, even sidestepping the answer to your question to begin with, is to say that it is pretty amazing that at a vascular biology conference, which is targeting basic science researchers, that there would be the attention played to disparities in healthcare. Really, really important because this is something that is an unmet need regarding the care of different populations. And so it is, frankly, very much gratifying to those of us in that community that have devoted our lives to studying these things, that basic scientists would be interested in this topic to make it an opening plenary session. Now, with regards to COVID-19, as you've already stated, it has disproportionately affected especially people of color, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and the Native American population in this country. And the deal there is, it really is a syndemic as opposed to a pandemic in those populations, because you have this intersection of chronic stressors, including the stressors related to racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, neighborhood context, an environment with overcrowding, underemployment, employment in jobs that require folks to go to work, despite the pandemic, so not having the ability to work from home, taking public transportation. These are all things that end up in the stressor bin. And those in concert with the pandemic affecting persons who have, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and who are obese, result in this outsized effect on certain communities. So stressors do have a play in this. And then at the back end of it, we're seeing a mental health crisis, which was predicted given the isolation, the job loss, loss of relatives and friends during this pandemic, that is now affecting, again, disproportionately communities of color.
So those are, things that are going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to be dealing not only with, again, the sort of basic biological drivers of things that might, be accelerating disease, but also additional new stressors. So the ones that were there before, disproportionately affecting these communities, and now, like you say, it's an outsized effect. And one thing that you mentioned as you began was this concept of vascular biology, and having the ideas of bringing this to the basic mechanisms and understanding how these things directly accelerate disease. And we had two really interesting talks. One was in the same opening plenary with Dr. Manu Platt, talking about sickle cell disease and how the biomechanical forces directly in the vessel then accelerate all of these other, aspects that make diseases, of course, which sickle cell disease, disproportionately affecting, African Americans. So we also saw a talk about psychosocial stress in mouse models, so stressing out the animals and seeing the ability of these direct biological impacts in the vessel wall. So I think what your talk was able to bring to us was the really dramatic ways that this is affecting disease in populations, and then now it's our job as the basic scientists to say, okay, what is happening at the molecular level and how can we intervene? So do you have some ideas about things that have been measured, in your work? We talked about inflammation, we talked about metrics of diabetes and obesity that you've really seen, dramatically impacted by the various types of stress and the aspects in your studies.
So I'm going to step back for a second and say that the talk that I gave was about adversity in cardiovascular disease.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I always say within that context is that psychosocial stress, especially chronic psychosocial stress, is a core component of adversity.
Mm-hmm.
And along those lines, there is the concept of the biology of adversity, which speaks to the accumulation or cumulative stressors experienced by persons over time that get imprinted in the brain, resulting in outputs that include heightened inflammation, heightened sympathetic nervous system or flight or fright response, a down regulation of the parasympathetic nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
and also dysregulation of the HPA or the hypothalamic pituitary axis, resulting in higher levels of cortisol, glucocorticoids, that then result in something called allostatic loading, which I refer to as the biological short circuiting of our the balance of our systems, resulting in things like diabetes, hypertension, other forms of cardiovascular disease. And at the molecular level, the core for atherosclerosis, for example, is endothelial dysfunction, heightened inflammation, and deposition of lipids, resulting in plaque formation. And heightened inflammation, especially at the edges of plaques, increase the likelihood of plaque rupture, and decrease the stability of plaques. And that is, essentially the basic pathophysiology of acute coronary syndromes and myocardial infarction. So as it relates to moving that to populations, we know that populations, especially my work has been focused on women and racial and ethnic diverse populations. We know that, for example, if we think about African American women, there's this concept of the superwoman schema. And that schema can be re-envisioned, and I wrote a perspective in Circulation about this, can be re-envisioned within that context of the biology of adversity, wherein the inputs that relate to the superwoman schema, such as stereotyping, history of disappointment, form other influences, and other types of things that can go into stress, can result in that cascade that result in maternal and non-maternal outcomes that tie into cardiovascular disease. So conceptually, the model is all about the biology of adversity. And certainly I lead a center that I started at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the only center that has this sort of focus and title as it relates to cardiovascular disease, which is called a Center for the Study of Adversity in Cardiovascular Disease and Nurture Center. So, I very much, believe that, we can move from a more basic biological model and follow that in a translational sense to, population outcomes that we see. When we think about mouse models or animal models, I should say, pertaining to how you translate that to what we see related to adversity in the population, certainly I think an important aspect of this is having diverse racial and ethnic investigators as part of the investigative team, because when you select the animal model you use, you may design your animal experiments to address concepts that you're seeing, at the population level.
Yeah.
What would be an example of that? If someone is exposed to stressors related to racial discrimination, and that engenders hypervigilance, then you may want to create a mouse model that simulates hypervigilance.
Right.
Okay. And utilize that for understanding, what happens at a cellular and a biological level.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that having the awareness and the data that you presented is in many ways, the underlying reason to do the studies that then relate to, the biology and the mechanisms. And I think that's another reason why, your presentation was just resounded so much with the basic scientist communities, because in some ways, we think of things like cholesterol and blood pressure all day. We don't think about all the other things that sort of human beings, experience. And I think that's really what is going to and continues to influence the way that, the vascular biology, basic science is going to happen. So that was really great. So thank you so much for this, Michelle. And it's been great to speak with you, and your session, as I said, was just such an amazing, energetic kickoff to our meeting, and everybody was buzzing. And we hope that in the future we'll continue to have you and your research group and talks, along, all these new lines of inquiry that many of us are just starting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I very much appreciate it. And it was an honor to be able to present.